The prince lived in a large palace with tall white walls and golden doors. From the outside, the palace looked beautiful and perfect. Inside, many servants worked every day and every night. They cleaned the floors, cooked food, washed clothes, opened doors, and stood quietly in long halls. They spoke softly and walked slowly. Their lives were simple, but their hearts were full of duty. The prince was very young. He had everything he wanted. Fine clothes, sweet food, soft beds, and many toys filled his rooms. Since childhood, servants did everything for him. When he woke up, they opened the curtains. When he ate, they served food silently. When he walked, they followed behind him. Because of this, the prince never learned how hard life could be. He never thought about the feelings of the servants. To him, they were just part of the palace, like walls or chairs. Every morning, the prince walked through the palace halls. Servants bowed their heads and stepped aside. Some smiled kindly, but the prince did not notice. He walked fast, thinking only about himself. Sometimes he felt lonely, but he did not understand why. He had many people around him, yet no one talked to him like a friend. One day, the king and queen had to leave the palace for a few days. They trusted the servants to take care of the prince. The prince felt angry. He did not like being alone without his parents. That morning, his mood was bad. When breakfast was late, he shouted at a servant. When his clothes were not ready, he threw them on the floor. The servants said nothing. They picked up the clothes and bowed their heads. Their silence made the prince even more angry. Later that day, the prince went to the garden. He wanted to play, but no one wanted to play with him. The guards stood far away. The servants worked quietly. The prince sat on a stone bench and felt something heavy in his chest. He did not understand the feeling, but it made his eyes wet. He looked at an old servant who was watering flowers nearby. The servant's hands were shaking, but he worked carefully, drop by drop. The prince watched him for a long time. Finally, the prince asked, "Why do you work so slowly?" The old servant stopped. He looked surprised. Servants were not used to being asked questions. He bowed and said softly, "My hands are old, my prince, but my heart still wants to serve well." The words stayed in the prince's mind. He had never heard a servant speak about his heart before. The prince stood up and walked away, but his steps were slower now. That night, the prince could not sleep. He thought about the old servant's tired hands. He thought about the silent faces he saw every day. For the first time, he wondered if the servants felt pain, sadness, or fear. His room felt too big and too quiet. He wished someone would sit and talk to him, not as a servant, but as a person. The next morning, the prince decided to walk alone in the palace. He went to the kitchen. The smell of warm bread filled the air. Servants were busy cutting, stirring, and cooking. When they saw the prince, they became nervous. They bowed quickly. The prince raised his hand and said, "Please do not bow. I just want to watch." The servants looked at each other in surprise. One young servant dropped a spoon because his hands were shaking. The prince felt something painful inside his chest. He realized they were afraid of him. He stayed in the kitchen for a while. He saw sweat on their faces. He saw tired eyes, but also care and love in their work. The prince quietly said, "Thank you for the food you make every day." The kitchen became very quiet. Some servants looked down. One woman wiped her eyes with her sleeve. No prince had ever thanked them before. During the day, the prince started to notice small things. A servant limping while carrying water. Another servant smiling even when his back hurt. At lunch, the prince waited instead of shouting. At night, he said, "Good night," to the guards. When the old servant from the garden passed by, the prince stopped him. "Your flowers are very beautiful," the prince said. The old servant smiled. His eyes shone with quiet happiness. "Thank you, my prince." That smile stayed in the prince's heart. He felt warm, but also sad. He understood how blind he had been. All this time, people with feelings and dreams were near him, but he never saw them. When the king and queen returned, they noticed the change. The prince was calmer, kinder. He listened more. One evening, the prince spoke softly to his parents. He said he wanted to learn how to serve others, not just be served. The servants heard about this and felt hope in their hearts. The palace did not change in one day, but something important had begun. The prince was no longer alone, and the servants no longer felt invisible. In the quiet halls of the palace, respect slowly replaced silence, and a young prince learned that true royalty lives in kindness, not power. The palace was very quiet that morning. Soft sunlight came through the tall windows and touched the cold marble floors. The servants were already awake. They moved gently, like shadows, careful not to make noise. Each of them had a duty. Some cleaned the halls, some prepared food, and some waited near the doors. Their lives followed the same path every day. The prince woke up in his large room. He sat on his bed and looked around. The room was full of beautiful things, but his heart felt empty. Since the day he started noticing the servants, his thoughts had changed. He remembered their tired faces and quiet voices. He remembered how afraid they looked when he entered the kitchen. That memory stayed with him like a small pain. The prince got dressed by himself that morning. When a servant came to help, the prince smiled and said, "I can do it today." The servant looked surprised but nodded. The prince felt strange happiness doing something on his own. It made him feel closer to the world outside his soft bed. At breakfast, the prince sat alone at the long table. Food was placed in front of him, but he waited. He looked at the servants standing far away. They did not eat until he finished. This made his heart feel heavy. He wondered how many times they went hungry because of him. After breakfast, the prince walked through the palace halls. He watched the servants closely now. He saw how they stopped talking when he came near. He saw how they bowed their heads and hid their feelings. He did not like this distance anymore. In the garden, he saw a young servant carrying heavy baskets of fruit. The baskets looked too big for her thin arms. The prince stopped and watched. Her steps were slow. Her face was red from the weight. The prince ran toward her and said, "Please stop. Let me help." The servant froze. Her eyes widened with fear. "No, my prince," she said quickly. "I must do this." The prince gently held one basket. It was heavy. His arms shook, but he did not let go. "You should not carry this alone," he said. They walked together for a short distance. Other servants watched from far away, whispering in disbelief. When they reached the storeroom, the prince placed the basket down and felt his heart beating fast. The servant bowed, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. That small moment changed something deep inside the prince. He realized that power did not mean standing above others. Power could also mean standing beside them. Later that day, the prince went to the servants' quarters. He had never been there before. The rooms were small and simple. Some servants rested on thin beds. Others cleaned old clothes or fixed broken shoes. When they saw the prince, fear filled their faces. "I am not here to judge," the prince said softly. "I want to understand." An old woman servant slowly stepped forward. Her hair was gray, and her back was bent. "We serve because it is our duty," she said. "But we are human too." Her words touched the prince deeply. He felt shame. He felt sadness. He felt love for these people who gave their lives to the palace. That evening, the prince did something no one expected. He asked the servants to sit and eat in the large hall. At first, no one moved. They thought it was a test. The prince sat down on the floor and waited. Slowly, one by one, they joined him. The hall felt warmer than ever before. They ate simple food. They shared quiet smiles. Some servants cried silently. The prince listened to their stories. He learned about their families, their dreams, and their pain. He realized that every servant carried a story inside their heart. As night fell, the prince felt tired, but his heart felt full. For the first time, he did not feel lonely in the palace. He understood that respect could heal wounds and kindness could break walls. The next day, the king noticed something strange. Servants walked with lighter steps. Their eyes looked brighter. The palace felt alive. When the king asked the prince what had changed, the prince answered softly, "I learned that humility makes a heart strong." From that day on, the prince never forgot the lesson. He still lived in a palace, but his heart no longer lived on a throne above others. It lived among the people who taught him what it truly meant to be royal. And in the quiet corners of the palace, love replaced fear, and a young prince became a true leader through humility.